Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to share with you some thoughts, expectations, and futurist visions for what's going to happen after the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I know a lot of folks have been adversely affected, businesses have been adversely affected, and we're going to see some knock-on effects going forward for many years after this. But there are also some opportunities, and in the long run, we might see some potential upsides realized as a result of the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this isn't to say that what's happened is good. This is a horrific situation, both from a public health standpoint and from a human lives loss standpoint and from an economic standpoint. But there are a few big changes that could happen that might result in outcomes that could be preferred. So there are a few things I want to share. First of all, a few big areas that are going to change: the future of work, right? We were already seeing a trend rising in remote working. And as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and pandemic shutdown, we saw a record number of people working from home. Most people who could were working from home. And the economy was really divided into three different sets of jobs: essential workers who had to be in person to do their jobs, remote workers who worked remotely where possible, and then non-essential, non-remote workers. And the big takeaway is really that for folks watching this, thinking about their careers, this really makes a pretty big statement, right? Because you're either in a job that's critical for the economy to go, you're in a job that you can do no matter what's going on with the pandemic, or you don't have a job. And that's really, that segmentation is something that's going to impact how people think about their working lives in the future. So in the future, we expect we're going to see a lot more people working remotely. The trend's already been rising. This situation pushed it parabolic. Many people working from home are never going to go back to their offices. Furthermore, many people who found themselves in non-essential, non-remote jobs that for all intents and purposes didn't exist during the COVID-19 pandemic and economic shutdown, those folks may seek jobs in the other two categories. And you might find young people are influenced for decades to come. For example, I'm an economist today and a futurist because in 1999, I finished undergraduate, I graduated college, and I thought in 2001, the economy will surely be better, right? 1999 was an amazing year to be hired, to graduate into the job market. 2001, I thought, it's going to be even better when I finish a master's degree. Not being an economist, I was absolutely wrong. And I thought, you know what, next time I want to be better prepared for this. And so that experience of the 2001 recession has cast a 2 decades long shadow over the future of my career. For many people who are looking at the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic shutdown, this will cast a multi-decades long shadow on what they choose as careers. Not just folks in the workforce now, but young people. People in college, high school, and even younger might be looking at this and will make decisions about what jobs they have based on this experience. So in the future, what do we expect for the future of work? Well, you're going to have a lot more people working remotely, and you're also probably going to have more people going into IT, more people going into healthcare. You're going to see impacts like that. In terms of the impact of the future of work side, if you see fewer people commuting, more people working from home, some people won't like this experience, many people haven't, but many people have. And so you're going to see potentially more people spending more time with their families. If they're not in cars commuting, they're spending more time at home. You'll see people also potentially consuming fewer fossil fuels, spending less time putting miles on their cars and spending more time at home. And I've often thought that decades from now, although now maybe it's just a few years, a child would ask, well, what was it like when you first started to work? And you tell them, well, I woke up in a house where I had a desk and a computer and a kitchen and a bathroom. And I, checked my email, and then I got in a car, drove for an hour, and went to work. And they had a desk and a computer and a kitchen and a bathroom. And then I got back and worked there for 8 hours, got back in a car, drove for another hour to go back home to where I have the same stuff, essentially. And someday I expect to tell this story to a kid, and the kid's going to go, that doesn't make sense. I don't believe you, right? And that, I think, really tells us where the future work's going. But if we think about impact, right, people might be spending more time at home, consuming less fossil fuel, spending less money, putting fewer miles on their cars. Those are all long-term wise, potentially positive benefits. We think about the future of education. That's an area we're going to see some big changes going forward as well. A lot of folks may never have tried online education. I've done 3 master's degrees. The third one I did was entirely online. I never went to the campus. Even when I defended my master's thesis project, I never met the person I was defending with. They were in Alaska when I was in Texas. This sort of thing is going to become much more common. This has been around for years. This has been building steam for a decade, right? We look at what's going on with simultaneous online courses, right? If we look at online options from LinkedIn Learning or elsewhere, right? The number of courses people are taking online has been going up parabolically over years. This really kicked it into hyperdrive. And I think people who were hoping to get more education now have seen an opportunity that, wow, you can get more skills and education online. And so if I think about, again, that multi-decade shadow that COVID-19 casts across the economy and society, well, 10, 20 years from now, you're potentially going to have a lot more educated people than you have now. In Texas, there's a project called 60 by 30. And it's the goal to have 60% of the population between the ages of 25 and 34 have some sort of post-secondary education by the year 2030. And that post-secondary education could be college, an associate's degree, right, a bachelor's degree, an associate's degree, a certificate, a trade certificate, something. I'd say that was a really ambitious goal back in 2019, but now, after seeing so many people turn to online education and the increased demand in online education, I got to believe that's a much more realistic goal now. You're going to have a lot more people pursuing a lot more education. And if we think about the future of the economy and the future of business, more people with more education is fundamentally a very good outcome for the economy, is really good for long-term growth and the health of society overall. A more educated populace is going to be a much more beneficial place to be. Now, a third area where we're likely to see some big changes that are probably going to be positive is in the area of public health and healthcare. So in addition to the future of work impact, where young people watching this might say, hey, you know what? Healthcare looks really important. And in the same way that some people might have enlisted in the military after September 11th, after the COVID-19 pandemic, you might see a lot of young people go into healthcare because they feel a calling and they think that they feel public health is important and they want to participate in that. And you know what? In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that there are already expected to be massive numbers of healthcare jobs created in the decades ahead. And yet we're expected to have shortfalls for doctors, for nurses, for nurse practitioners, for home health aides, for any kind of healthcare professional almost. They're expected to be massive increased demands going forward. Some of the biggest categories of increased jobs going forward are likely to be in healthcare. So people answering this calling as part of that future work piece could turn out to be really good for long-term public health outcomes. After all, what does a society want? Well, certainly if we have more healthcare providers, that's going to give you a better long-term outcome. If we have a more educated populace, that's a much better long-term outcome. And if we have more people maybe working remotely, spending more time with their families and less time sitting in cars or in trains and buses, right, just commuting somewhere, all those three things could potentially give us long-term better outcomes. Now, those are kind of the most optimistic long-term potential impacts that I expect after the COVID-19 pandemic as we look forward. There are a few areas where we have more negative expectations and we're a bit more concerned about, right? So I'm quite concerned if we look forward, what do we see for the future of finance, right? Central banks have come in to make the economy essentially be too big to fail, right? Both in the United States, where the Fed has stepped in, also in Europe, where the European Central Bank has stepped in. And those central bank balance sheets are going up. Basically, the governments are printing debt, the central banks are buying the debt. And so this is modern monetary theory is what they call it, but you're printing money with the left hand and kind of buying it with the right hand. And this can keep interest rates low, But what it also means is it's very difficult for you to ever reduce the balance sheet. Have we seen banks try? Absolutely, right? The central bank balance sheet was quite low. It was below $1 trillion in the United States before the Great Recession, which lasted from December 2007 to June 2006 to June 2009. During that period, though, and after, the central bank balance sheet went from under $1 trillion to where we saw it be over $4 trillion just a few years ago. Now, the Fed tried to reduce the size of that balance sheet in 2018, early 2019, and then they had to quickly reverse course. It weighed very strongly on growth, and business investment in the United States was in recession in the last 3 quarters of 2019. Long before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were 3 quarters consecutively of business investment contractions. And there was also a contraction in Q1 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's 4 consecutive quarters of business investment contractions, driven largely by the central bank trying to reduce its balance sheet, not reinvesting its principal. Basically, one of the biggest buyers of mortgages and treasuries stepped back from the market, right? The biggest buyer. So that's kind of a dangerous prospect. The European Central Bank had even before that tried to wind down its central bank balance sheet. That too had risen sharply after the Great Recession and tried to reduce it between 2012 and 2014 from a little over 3 trillion euros to a little over 2 trillion euros, somewhere in that range. But then it's spiked since, again, pushing the Eurozone economy almost into recession during that unwind period, failed miserably, and the ECB had to come in and buy. So we've seen both from the European Central Bank in 2012 to 2014 and in the Fed 2018 and 19 that it's really tough to reduce your central bank balance sheet, even though right now that's been the solution, right? The Fed has come in, bought all kinds of investment grade debt, has even been willing to buy some sub-investment grade debt, and yet we don't know if this will ever go down again or if it can go down. And there's a risk that since this works, right, this juices the economy. We know the Fed and the European Central Bank, other central banks are likely to do this again. There are a few big things about finance, I think, and one is, right, central banks want the economy to be growing and stable. The second thing is, if they have tools to do it and they work, they will use them again. And the third piece is, as we've just discussed, you really can't reduce the size of your balance sheet. So what does this mean if we look 10, 20, 30 years forward? Well, this means that central bank balance sheets are probably going to continue going up, 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 and they're going to continue buying more kinds of debt, more investment grade debt, more junk bond debt. Going forward, they're going to buy a lot more stuff. That seems certain. And this isn't a surprise. Janet Yellen said in August of 2016 that in the future, the Fed, she was at the time the Fed chair, the Fed may wish to buy a broader range of assets. And here we are, the Fed is buying all kinds of assets. So looking forward, we just see these balance sheets becoming 10 trillion, 20 trillion, 30 trillion, 40, right? It's just going to go up. Every time the economy slows, central banks are going to pile in all kinds of money. Now, there are 2 impacts here when we think about inflation. Consumer inflation seems very low. In fact, in the United States, if we look at 2019, the average pace of inflation was 1.8%. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate was 3.7 for the year, a 50-year low. So this is kind of wild because here you'd think there's a super tight job market. Why isn't there consumer inflation? Well, some of it might be cost disintermediation because of the internet and e-commerce and all that stuff. But some of it might be really that the inflation is showing up on the asset side, that by the Fed coming in and buying debt of all kinds, especially mortgages, treasuries, but now everything else, asset valuations go up. Companies, real estate, equities, right? Anything like that goes up in value, but consumables, those prices remain low. So we don't see the inflation in the CPI, but we see it in assets. So this is something to be cognizant of as we're thinking about what can we see in the future. Could we see a lot more debt and also still very little inflation and yet massive balance sheets? Absolutely. We've seen it before. we're likely to continue to see that kind of thing go forward. So as the future of finance, we are concerned about that kind of outlook. Now, there are a few other areas we're a bit concerned about. Some are maybe more near term. I think the future of energy is going to be choppy here for a number of months. We look at the expectations. The truth is, with commodities, there's kind of one big golden rule. Commodities are bought and not sold. And that means that oil prices, metals, industrial metals prices, not to be confused with precious metals, but industrial metals prices like copper, aluminum, iron ore, those are bought. The demand driver is global manufacturing. The demand driver is global growth, especially emerging market wealth and growth. Because the truth is, emerging markets are where you have an emerging middle class, you've got increased demand for durable goods, right? You've got increased demand for transportation fuels. That's where the demand hotspots are. And if emerging markets recover, you're going to see strong demand. But in the OECD, in the most advanced economies, where we have much more heavily service-based economies and well-established middle classes, automotive and fuels demand could drop. Auto sales could be soft for years. Oil prices might struggle to rise because inventories are high. And even though there's increased demand in emerging markets, it could put some limits on the upside. So energy markets might struggle there. The commuting reduction of demand in the United States and Europe, part of that could be permanent. If we look at the impact going forward for transportation fuels, for flights, we could see weak air travel for years after this. Even as we're talking here, the flight capacity for most days in the United States is about 80 to 85% lower than it was in 2019. So it might take a little while, especially as people adapt to new business models. Now, one of the upsides of some of this is that you'll see people will be spending less on fuels and travel if they're able to do more work. And that means they'll also be producing fewer fossil fuels. But for energy companies, this is going to present a challenge. Also for renewables companies, especially for those focused on fuels and transportation, those typically are more expensive anyway, and a low price of oil could actually make it less cost effective for people to buy electric vehicles or hybrids or anything like that. If you wanted to see lots of electric vehicles, lots of hybrids on the road, you want $100 oil, not $40 oil. So that's kind of some of the trade-off we'll see going forward. On the renewable side, one of the most likely things that's likely to continue is that power generation will continue to see increased levels of renewables, although natural gas will remain a massive part of the power production for some time. Coal is falling off, but the renewables piece will rise. Transportation fuels, though, are very different than power. There is really not any great liquid transportable form of transportation energy that's nearly as good as hydrocarbons from an efficiency standpoint. So that's what we expect going forward. We're going to see some challenges in terms of moving over to electric vehicles because some of the price differential gets tougher to capture. Furthermore, if we think about the fleet turning over, existing cars, people buying new cars, it's really tough to justify buying a lot of new cars if all those people aren't commuting anymore. And if there's a lot of used cars on the market because people who aren't commuting might get rid of the cars they already own. So we could see a multi-year impact and actually a slowing in the transition to electric vehicles. That actually could be a smaller percentage than people have been forecasting going forward because the number of cars on the road that consume petroleum fuels might be here longer, and the cost differential just isn't there. The ROI isn't there to make the switch. So those are a few different areas we expect some major changes. The last piece is sort of a mixed bag that I want to share if we look going forward. Supply chain is one of the areas that really came under a microscope during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we think about the importance of supply chain. It's more important than ever before. E-commerce, more important than ever before. Many people were reliant on e-commerce and supply chain and various grocery delivery apps just to get the food and the basic necessities they needed at their homes when everything was shut down. If this pandemic had happened in 2001, it would have been much worse because we didn't have the e-commerce that we have now. But a lot of companies that have been improving the e-commerce, that's going to accelerate. We do expect that's going to have a few different impacts. We're going to see more automation in the supply chain. You're going to see more efficiency, more people reliant on it. On the negative, you're going to see brick and mortar real estate take a hit. You're going to see a few other areas take hits as well. But really, the retail side is going to potentially take a hit as more people continue to have an in-hand storefront rather than going out to a store. That's likely to accelerate over time. One other thing, though, that's a bit negative, this is kind of, like I said, a mixed bag topic, is that the global supply chain dynamics that have been quite tense between the United States and China since the global trade war started in 2018 could potentially ramp up as a result of everything around the COVID-19 pandemic. So the insecurity of supply chain, the frenemy relationship between the United States and China, what national security professionals call the great power competition between those two entities, could heat up in the years to come. And that's going to have an impact on technology supply chains, as well as on material supply chains, aluminum and steel, that have been impacted by the Section 232 tariffs. And there's a potential we're going to see more tariffs put on, more restrictions placed, and a bigger push towards having medical device, PPE, biologics, and all kinds of things like that produced in the United States. I think we could see some tariffs that try to incentivize that behavior. And in general, I think we're going to see more manufacturing in the United States in the future as well, as people found it impossible to get certain goods they needed because they were coming from far afield during a pandemic. We might get more manufacturing as a percent of GDP in the United States, but it seems, I would argue, a bit unlikely that we would get a lot more manufacturing jobs, even though we might get a lot more manufacturing activity. I am thinking about a lot of technology is becoming really critical there. So those are kind of the main pieces we see as changes. One footnote here, I'd mentioned retail could take a real hit on the e-commerce. Obviously, retail real estate's going to take a hit. Commercial real estate, as more people work from home, very likely to take a hit as well. And we could see the arbitrage between the cost differentials of living in cities versus living in the suburbs. We could see that gap close. As if people are working remotely, they probably prefer to have more square footage in their home rather than be very close to an office that they never go to. In other words, they probably will prioritize space over proximity. That's going to have an impact, especially on prices of homes in sort of second-tier cities, smaller cities. Those prices could rise as more people choose to live there remotely, where their dollars will go further, or their euros or pounds. So those are the main talking points. Again, thank you very much for having me here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.